The dining room at Hartsmere House held 40 people, and for the space of 3 seconds, not a single sound. The announcement had been made, the name spoken, the champagne raised, and then the woman whose name it was had set down her glass with the particular care of someone who has made a decision, pushed back her chair without assistance, and walked the full length of the room to the double doors, which a footman opened just in time and which closed behind her with a softness that was somehow worse than a slam. At the far end of the table, Lady Vivienne Cassel heard the silence settle over the assembled guests like a held breath, and she looked down at the dessert course that had just been placed before her, a syllabub in a crystal glass, pale and cold, and registered that her dessert fork was missing. The lacayo who had cleared the previous course had taken it with the plate. She caught the eye of the nearest footman, glanced once at the syllabub, and waited with her hands in her lap and her expression arranged into nothing in particular, while the room sat suspended around her, and the Duke of Hartsmere stood at the head of the table, with his champagne still raised and nowhere useful to put it. The footman returned with a clean fork. Vivienne accepted it, turned to the syllabub, and ate. The room, which had desperately needed somewhere to look, looked at her. She was 35 years old, widowed 4 years, and she understood precisely what the room was doing. It was using her composure as permission to resume its own. If Lady Cassel could attend to her dessert, then perhaps the evening was not entirely destroyed. Perhaps there was a script for this after all. Perhaps they could all survive the next 40 minutes. She gave them nothing else. She finished the syllabub, set down her fork, and accepted a refill of her wine from a footman who looked as though he would rather be anywhere else on earth. At the head of the table, Piers Aldgate, Duke of Hartsmere, had finally lowered his glass. He was speaking to the gentleman on his right, and his voice was even, and Vivienne did not look at him. She was aware of him, as she had been aware of him for 2 years, the way one is aware of a fire in a room, not staring at it, not moving toward it, simply knowing it was there and regulating one's position accordingly. He passed behind the chairs on the near side of the table during the general movement that followed dessert, the room reorganizing itself with the faint desperation of 40 people who had witnessed a social catastrophe and were now required to pretend the otherwise. His hand grazed the back of her chair as he passed, not her shoulder, not her arm, just the carved wood of the chair back. And he did not stop or slow, and she did not turn. But she registered it. The warmth of his passing, the deliberateness, or perhaps the accidentalness of it. The fact that she had no way to know which it was, and that this particular uncertainty had been the condition of their acquaintance for 2 years. She stayed another 30 minutes, spoke to 3 people, declined a 4th conversation with a smile that closed the subject, and left at a time that was late enough not to appear to flee, and early enough not to appear to enjoy herself. Her house in Marylebone was quiet when she arrived. Her lady's maid, Agnes, took her wrap and her gloves and asked no questions, which was one of the things Vivienne valued most about her. She dismissed Agnes at the door to her bedroom, carried her own candle to the small writing desk by the window, and sat down. She kept a diary. Not a confessional, she was too careful for confessionals, but a record, a practice of the habit her father had instilled in her. Write what you actually think, once a day, and then you will know what you actually think. She had kept it since she was 16. She had burned exactly 1 volume, the one that covered the year her family's finances collapsed, and she had regretted the burning ever since. She opened the current volume and wrote for an hour. She wrote that she had known about the fraud for 3 months. She wrote that she had recognized the pattern in the first week, the same layered misrepresentation, the same manufactured documentation, the same particular confidence of a woman who had done this before. Because she had seen it at 19, from the receiving end, in her father's study when the solicitor came to explain what had happened to everything. She wrote that she had assembled the evidence carefully, and delivered it to Piers's solicitor 6 weeks ago because there was no other person she could give it to without it being dismissed or misdirected. And because she had understood, at the moment she made the decision, that she could not watch Piers Aldgate deceived and do nothing. She did not write why she could not watch it. She was not ready for that sentence yet. She wrote that the room had been very quiet when the doors closed, and that the syllabub had been adequate, and that she was not certain what came next, but that she would be ready for it. She wrote that she had 1 hour to be honest about how she felt, and that she intended to use it. She used it. She wrote 3 pages that she would not burn, because she had learned from the one she had, and because the truth deserved to be somewhere, even if only in a locked drawer. Then she set the pen down, closed the book, and went to bed. By morning, she had her face ready for the weeks ahead. 3 days after the dinner, a letter arrived from a solicitor's office on Gray's Inn Road. It was addressed in a formal hand, brief, and thanked her for the information previously provided, which had been of material assistance in a matter recently concluded. It was signed by the solicitor, not by Piers. There was no accompanying note. Vivienne read it twice. She set it on the desk beside her morning tea and sat with it for the time it took to drink the cup. He had not written. He had not called. He had not sent any word through any channel that was not filtered through a legal intermediary. The silence was absolute and, she understood now, deliberate. And she spent the next several minutes working out what it meant, because it could mean 2 very different things, and the difference mattered. It could mean that he had received the evidence, understood its source, and chosen to protect her from the exposure of being named. That his silence was a form of shelter, however cold a form. Or it could mean that he had received the evidence, understood its source, and had drawn his own conclusions about her motives. Conclusions that were wrong, that she could see from here were wrong, and that he had apparently not found it worth his time to verify. She considered both possibilities with the methodical attention she brought to most problems. Then she folded the solicitor's letter, placed it in the desk drawer, and accepted that she would not know which it was until she saw his face. She did not have to wait long to see his face, because the season provided ample opportunity for that particular discomfort. Lady Forsmore began her campaign in the 2nd week. Vivienne did not see it directly. She was not meant to. But she could map its progress through the temperature of rooms she entered, through the particular quality of greeting she received from 3 women who had been warm the previous month and were now merely civil, through a table seating at a dinner party that placed her far from the interesting conversation and near the door. Forsmore was Piers's aunt by marriage, had negotiated the original engagement, and had lost considerable positioning when it collapsed. She was not a cruel woman by nature. She was, however, a precise one, and her counter-campaign had the efficiency of someone who knew exactly which threads to pull. Vivienne told no one. She did not explain herself to anyone who had not asked, and no one had asked directly, because the story circulating without her participation was sufficiently complete that most people felt they already knew. In the version now in general circulation, she was the architect of the disaster. A widow of uncertain motives who had interfered in a ducal engagement for reasons that were left tastefully unspecified, but were understood to involve proximity and ambition. She was, in short, precisely what the room had suspected she might be on the night she asked for a clean fork while the bride was still warm. She prepared to navigate this story from the outside. Correcting it from within would require explanations she was not willing to give. The first charitable concert of the season was held at a private house in Grosvenor Square, and Vivienne arrived in a gray silk that her late husband had once called severe, and that she considered well suited to the purpose. She spoke to several people. listened to a soprano who was better than expected, and was navigating the doorway between the music room and the supper room when Lady Forsmore appeared in the threshold. Forsmore was 52, well-dressed, and had the particular authority of a woman who had been managing social situations for 30 years. She stopped directly in Vivienne's path, which left Vivienne the choice of stopping also or walking through her. Vivienne stopped. "Lady Cassel," Forsmore said, with the warmth of someone who has decided that warmth costs nothing and signals nothing. "How brave of you to come." The remark was designed to land on two levels simultaneously, a compliment on the surface, a suggestion underneath that Vivienne's presence required courage because her position was precarious. It was well executed. Vivienne acknowledged it with a slight inclination of her head that committed her to nothing. "Lady Forsmore," Vivienne said. "The soprano was excellent. I believe she studied in Milan." "Did she?" Forsmore's eyes moved briefly to the room behind Vivienne. "I confess I found it difficult to concentrate this evening. There is so much to occupy one's attention at present." "There always is," Vivienne agreed pleasantly, and waited. Forsmore's voice dropped a register, still social, still deniable, but aimed now with precision. "I do hope you understand that certain actions, however well-intentioned, have consequences that extend beyond the person who takes them. Some of us have spent years building arrangements that cannot simply be dismantled without cost to everyone involved." Vivienne looked at her. "I understand consequences rather well," she said. "Better than most people in this room, I think." She did not say anything further, because there was nothing further that needed to be said, and because she could see from Forsmore's expression that the response had not been the one anticipated, either a retreat or an explanation, and that the absence of either had created a small, useful uncertainty. What she did not see, because she was looking at Forsmore, was Piers Aldgate moving through the room behind them. He had been nearby. How nearby, she could not have said. She had been aware of him across the room earlier in the evening with the same peripheral precision she always maintained. But he had apparently come close enough to see Forsmore's position in the doorway, because he arrived at her left elbow without particular hurry and addressed Forsmore with the ease of a man who has just remembered an urgent question. "Aunt," he said, "I believe Ashworth was looking for you specifically. Something about the committee arrangement for the Marylebone Fund. He seemed quite insistent." Forsmore looked at him. A brief, readable look. She understood perfectly well what was happening. And then she composed herself, offered Vivienne a smile of the kind that reserves all positions, and moved away toward the supper room. Piers did not watch her go. He looked at Vivienne instead, and Vivienne looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Thank you," she said. "I dislike scenes in doorways," he said flatly. "It has nothing to do with you." "Of course," Vivienne said. Neither of them believed that was the complete explanation. They both knew it. He moved away without ceremony, and she continued through the doorway. And she told herself, in the supper room with a glass of wine she did not particularly want, that the fact that he had moved at all meant nothing she was permitted to rely on. The bookshop on Pall Mall was the sort of place that smelled of old paper and lamp oil, and the particular dust of volumes that had been handled by a great many careful readers. Vivienne went there on a Thursday morning when she was not expected anywhere, and had no specific errand except the desire to be somewhere quiet with useful things to think about. She found the volume she wanted in the second room, a natural history she had been meaning to examine for a month, and reached for it at exactly the same moment that a hand came from her left and reached for the same spine. She looked up, Piers looked down. Neither of them withdrew their hand. The book sat between them for a moment that lasted considerably longer than the situation required. "Lady Cassel," he said. "Your Grace," she said. He looked at the book. She looked at the book. The bookshop was quiet around them, occupied by two elderly gentlemen in the next room, and a clerk at the front who was apparently absorbed in a catalog. "You appear to need it urgently," he said. "I came for it specifically," she said. "Though I suspect you came for it specifically as well. I have been meaning to read it for some time." "As have I." He released the spine. "Then you should have it." "That is unexpectedly generous," she said, taking it. "Or you have simply decided how it must be, and are presenting the outcome as a gift." He looked at her. There was something in his expression that she recognized. The particular sharpening that happened when she said something that caught him, that did not land where he expected. "That," he said, "is an unusually accurate characterization of a decision about a natural history." "I find accuracy useful," she said. "More useful than most people seem to." "So I have observed," he said. And there was something in those 4 words that was not quite neutral, that carried the weight of the previous weeks without naming them. She held the book. He stood with his hands at his sides. The clerk in the front room turned a page. "I hope the reading serves you well," he said at last. "I expect it will," she said. And she took the book to the clerk and paid for it. And she did not look back when she left, though she was aware, with the precision she could not seem to turn off, that he was watching her go. The cards evening at Mrs. Hartley's house on Berkeley Street was crowded and warm, and Vivienne played 3 hands of whist with the focused attention she brought to games she did not particularly care about, but was not willing to lose. She declined twice to be drawn into conversation with Piers, once across a card table, once in the doorway between rooms. And the second time, she made her excuses to her companion and stepped through the French doors to the terrace. The rain had been falling since early evening, a light, persistent rain that had kept most of the guests firmly inside. The terrace was empty. Vivienne stood at the stone balustrade with the rain coming down on the garden below and the light from the windows behind her. And she breathed. She heard the door open behind her. She did not need to turn to know who it was. "You are getting wet," Piers said. "I had noticed," she said. "I preferred it to the present alternative." He came to stand beside her at the balustrade. He was not wearing his hat. The rain was doing something to the shoulders of his coat that he appeared not to care about. "I know you were the source," he said. No preamble, no approach. Direct, as he always was when he had decided a thing. "I have known since the solicitor confirmed it." "I know," she said. He looked at the garden. The rain fell on the gravel paths and the box hedges, steady and indifferent. "I have been considering," he said, "what the most credible explanation for your actions is, given what I know of you, given the circumstances." Vivienne waited. "I have concluded," he said, "that you acted to clear the field, that you saw an opportunity, identified a means of creating one, and took it. It is the explanation that fits what I know of how you operate." She turned to look at him then. He was in profile, watching the garden, and she could see the certainty in the set of his jaw, the particular quality of conviction in a man who has thought something through to his own satisfaction. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough for the rain to have made a small dark line along his collar, long enough for the air between them to acquire a weight that had nothing to do with the weather. "I prefer the rain to this conversation," she said. And she walked back inside. She heard nothing from the terrace, no step, No door, no sound of him following. She took a glass of wine from a passing tray and rejoined the nearest group of guests and spent the next 20 minutes being entirely pleasant. And she did not let herself think about the specific quality of wrongness in what he had just said to her face, or the fact that she had not corrected it, or the particular effort that not correcting it had required. He had handed her his error directly. She had refused to take it. She was not yet certain whether that had been dignity or cowardice, and she suspected the answer was both. The folded paper arrived on a Tuesday morning in early December, delivered to her bedroom door by Agnes with an expression that suggested she had found it in the drawer of the writing desk while straightening the room, and had known immediately that it did not belong with the ordinary correspondence. Vivienne recognized the paper before she recognized the handwriting. It was her own. A heavier stock she had used some years ago, before she had switched to the lighter cream she preferred now. She unfolded it with the particular care of someone who suspects they are about to read something they are not prepared for. It was dated 6 months earlier. It was addressed to Piers. It had never been sent. She had believed she had burned it. She read it in its entirety, standing at the window in her dressing gown, with the morning light coming in gray and cold. And she read it again more slowly the second time. It was everything she had refused to say. It explained the fraud, its pattern, its match to what had happened to her family 15 years ago. It explained why she had gone to the solicitor rather than to him directly. Because naming herself as source publicly would have required explaining how she recognized the pattern, which would have required the conversation she was not prepared to have. It explained that she had acted to protect him because she had known what this kind of fraud looked like before it became visible, and that she had understood, in assembling the evidence, that the cost to herself was probable, and the benefit to him was not guaranteed, and that she had proceeded anyway. And it contained, in the third paragraph, a line she could not disown. "I could not watch you deceived, and I could not tell you that without telling you something I was not prepared to say." She set the letter down on the writing desk. She stood with her hands flat on the desk surface and looked at the letter and thought about what it would mean to send it and what it would mean not to. She had one afternoon. She sent it. Piers read the letter in his study at Hartsmere House at 4:30, with the fire going and a glass of brandy he had poured and not touched. He read it once quickly and then again with the specific attention of a man who is looking for the place where the logic fails, because the logic failing would be easier than the alternative. The logic did not fail. He set the letter on the desk. He sat with it for the time it took the fire to burn down 1/4 of an inch. Then he stood, put on his coat, and went out. His knock at her door in Marylebone came at 5:30, and Agnes showed him to the sitting room without apparent surprise, which told him something about the household's expectations for the afternoon. Vivienne was standing at the fireplace when he came in. She did not sit, and he did not suggest it. The room was warm, the curtains drawn against the December dark, and they were, for the first time since the dinner at Hartsmere House, entirely alone without the structure of a social occasion around them. He had the letter in his hand. He set it on the side table. "Why did you not come to me directly?" he asked. It was. She registered with something that moved through her, like a shift in the room's temperature. The correct question. Not an accusation. Not a conclusion presented for her confirmation. A question asked plainly, by someone who had decided to find out rather than to be right. "Because the fraud I recognized destroyed my family," she said. "When I was 20 years old, a woman with a very similar pattern of documentation persuaded 3 separate investors that she had assets she did not have. My father was one of them. By the time anyone saw it clearly, there was nothing left to protect. She paused, and then continued, because she had decided to answer fully. I recognized the pattern in your fiancé's financial arrangements within a week of meeting her. I spent 2 months verifying it, because I needed to be certain, and because I was aware that bringing this to you directly would require me to explain how I knew what I was looking at. And explaining that would have required me to tell you things about my family's history that I had not told anyone, and to explain why I had been paying close enough attention to your fiancé's affairs to notice. He was very still. It was the stillness she had seen on the terrace, but different in quality. Not the stillness of a man holding a certainty in place, but the stillness of a man taking something in. And naming yourself as source publicly, he said, would have done exactly what Forsmore is doing now, she said, except 6 weeks earlier and without the time to prepare for it. He looked at her. I thought you acted to clear the field for yourself. I know, she said. You told me so on a terrace in the rain. Something crossed his face, not quite a wince, but adjacent to one. I did, he said. You were wrong, she said. Not with anger, because she had spent the anger in the 3 weeks since the terrace, had used it up writing in her diary and walking her garden and doing the patient work of continuing to exist in a city that had decided what she was. Entirely wrong. You made a decision about my motives and presented it to me as a conclusion, and I did not correct you, which I regret. Why didn't you? She thought about this. Because correcting you would have required telling you that I had a reason to care what happened to you that was not tactical, she said. And I was not ready to say that. The fire made a small sound. Outside, a carriage passed on the street. I see, he said quietly. Do you? I think I am beginning to, he said. He stayed for another half hour. They talked about the fraud, about the solicitor's confirmation he had received, about the specific mechanism of how he had received the evidence and chosen to protect her as source. A choice he named directly and without self-congratulation, and that she received with the particular quality of attention she gave to information that changed the shape of something she thought she understood. When he rose to leave, he took her hand at the sitting room door. Not a bow, not the formal touch of a social occasion. He took her hand and held it for a moment, briefly, and she felt the warmth of it all the way up her arm. And then he released it and said good night, and she heard Agnes show him out. She stood in the sitting room for a while after he left, her hand at her side, and did not immediately move to do anything else. The solicitor's written confirmation arrived for Piers on the Thursday, a formal document independent of Vivienne's account that matched the fraud she had identified against a documented pattern from 3 previous cases, and that established her knowledge of it as predating the engagement by nearly 5 months. It was thorough and, in the way of legal documents, entirely without sympathy for the position it placed him in. He sat with it in his study for the better part of an hour. He sat specifically with the memory of a terrace in the rain, and a woman looking at him for a long moment before she said she preferred the rain to the conversation. He had delivered his wrong reading of her to her face. He had been precise about it. He had used the word conclude, as though he had done the work of concluding rather than the work of deciding and calling it by a better name. He had been wrong about her in the specific way that was hardest to be wrong. Not through ignorance, but through the choice to stop short of knowing. Meanwhile, a brief item appeared in one of the society columns, the kind of column that operated through implication and deniability, that referred to a recent scandal in ducal circles and mentioned, in passing, a widow of uncertain motives whose friendship with the principal party has attracted considerable comment. It did not name Vivienne. It did not need to. Vivienne received the column, read it, and set it aside. Her invitation list had been narrowing for 3 weeks. Not dramatically, not ruin, but a slow reduction. A door here and a supper there. The kind of contraction that was designed to be deniable and was also designed to accumulate. She was not frightened by it. She had rebuilt her position from further back than this. But that afternoon, she went to the garden. It was a cold afternoon, December gray, the garden stripped down to its bones. She walked the gravel path between the bare rose canes and the dormant lavender beds, and she allowed herself, for the first time in 4 years, to want things she had not permitted herself to want. Not vague things, specific things. Warmth. A table with someone at the other end of it who would argue with her and mean it. The particular quality of being known by someone who had earned the knowledge. She had told herself for 4 years that she did not need these things, and the telling had been so thorough and so consistent that she had nearly believed it. She walked the garden for an hour. She did not cry. She was not built for weeping in gardens, and she knew it, and she did not try. She simply let herself want what she wanted clearly and without negotiation, in the cold air with the bare roses around her. And then she went inside and resumed her correspondence. The invitation to the Cavendish Assembly Rooms came through her friend Mrs. Alderton, who had been one of the few people in Vivienne's circle who had asked a direct question after the dinner and received a direct answer and had drawn her own conclusions accordingly. "You should go," Mrs. Alderton said, in her sitting room on a gray morning with tea between them. "Visibility serves you better than slow erasure. Every week you are absent from these rooms, Forsmore fills the space with her version." "Forsmore's version is the one the room prefers," Vivienne said. "It is tidier." "Tidy stories have a weakness," Mrs. Alderton said. "They require the subject to stay absent. The moment you walk into a room, you become inconvenient to the story." Vivienne almost declined anyway. She went. The note from Piers arrived the morning of the assembly. Brief, direct, in his own hand. "I will be present this evening and intend to make myself useful. I am aware this is not a request." She wrote back, "Do not be heroic on my behalf. I am not a cause." His response arrived within the hour. "I have no intention of heroics. I intend to be honest on my own account. Those are different things." She read it twice. She folded it and put it in her desk drawer, and spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of attention she could not quite classify. That evening, at 7 o'clock, Piers arrived at her house in Marylebone unannounced, carrying a folded document in one hand and his hat in the other, and Agnes showed him in, without visible surprise. He set the solicitor's written confirmation on the table between them. He had brought his own copy, she understood. Not to show her evidence she had already provided, but to show her that he had read it with the attention it deserved. "I owe you a specific accounting," he said, "of where my reasoning failed." "Piers," she said, and then stopped, because she had used his name without the title, and she had not done that before, and he had noticed. "Go on," he said. "You do not have to account to me," she said. "You have already done it." "Not completely," he said. "I told you that you were wrong about my silence after the solicitor received your information. I did not tell you what I was wrong about." He looked at her steadily. "I received the evidence. I understood immediately that you were the source, and I made the decision not to contact you because I told myself it was to protect you. And that was true as far as it went. But it was also easier, at the time, to not contact you than to examine why the evidence had come from you and not from anyone closer to me. That is the part I did not tell you. The room was very quiet. You did not want to examine it, she said. I did not want to examine what it said about who had been paying attention, he said, and what it said about who had not. She looked at him. He looked back. The candles on the mantelpiece threw unsteady light across his face, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was most himself in moments of difficulty. Most precise, most present, most worth the trouble of knowing. I have spent 2 years, she said, telling myself that I did not care what you thought of me. I know, he said. I was wrong, she said. He crossed the room in 3 steps and kissed her, once, deliberately, with both hands at her face, and she stood with her hands at his lapels and did not move. And the room held them both in the candlelight for a moment that was complete in itself. When he stepped back, neither of them spoke. The fire made its small sounds. He looked at her with an expression she recognized, finally, as the one he wore when he had stopped deciding and started knowing. Then he said good night and left. And she stood at the window and watched the street below until his carriage had gone. And the street was quiet. And she was still standing there. The Cavendish assembly rooms on the following evening were lit with 100 candles and occupied by 40 guests in their winter best. And the evening was well advanced before anything happened that changed the character of it. Vivienne had been there for 2 hours. She had spoken to Mrs. Alderton, to 2 women who had been cooling toward her and who had apparently decided, on seeing her present and composed, to reconsider their position, and to a gentleman of her late husband's acquaintance who had the good manners not to reference anything that had happened in the past month. She had accepted a glass of wine she did not particularly need, and held it as a social instrument, and watched the room with the attention she brought to rooms that required watching. Peers had been present since the beginning of the evening. They had exchanged a single look across the room, which had been enough for both of them, and had not spoken yet. And she had found this unremarkable, because they had spent 2 years being in rooms together without speaking, and she was very good at it. Lady Forsmore rose at 9:15. She did not raise her voice. She was too accomplished for that. She simply assumed the authority of a woman who has stood in such rooms for 30 years and who understands that attention is a resource that flows toward certainty, and she directed it. I hope, she said, to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone, that we are all sufficiently acquainted with the recent history of a certain engagement to understand the present company clearly. She paused. The room, which had been in mid-conversation, was not quite silent, but it was attending. Lady Cassel has been received here this evening with, I think, more generosity than the circumstances might suggest is warranted. Another pause, more deliberate. For those who are not fully informed, Lady Cassel was the source of the information that reached the solicitor. She was the instrument of a broken engagement and a considerable amount of unhappiness for several people in this room. Her motives for this action have been the subject of some discussion, and I think it is fair to say that the most credible explanation is not a flattering one. The room turned. Slowly, the way rooms do when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Not all at once, but in the accumulating way of 40 people realizing simultaneously where to look. Vivienne looked at Forsmore. She did not move, and then Piers stood. He had been across the room, near the windows. He rose without particular haste, without the quality of a man performing an entrance. And when he spoke, his voice was the voice she had heard across dinner tables and in bookshops and on wet terraces, precise, even, carrying without being raised. Lady Forsmore, he said. "I would like to correct the record." The room was fully silent now. "I received information from a source whose identity I was aware of," he said. "I did not adequately verify the source's motives before I formed a conclusion about them, and I held that conclusion with more confidence than it deserved. The conclusion was wrong." He paused, and there was nothing theatrical about the pause. It was simply the pause of a man organizing what he intends to say. The source acted because she recognized a pattern of financial fraud that had destroyed her own family 15 years ago. She brought the evidence to my solicitor rather than to me directly, because doing so publicly would have exposed her to exactly the position she is now in. And she made that choice anyway, to protect me from a deception I was not positioned to see coming. She did not tell me any of this. I did not ask. Forsmore had not sat down. She was still standing, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had understood, halfway through the second sentence, that the conversation had moved beyond anything she could redirect. "I attributed her actions to personal ambition," Piers continued. "I was wrong. I said so to her face, on a terrace in the rain, in a manner that was both specific and entirely incorrect. And she declined to correct me, which she should not have had to do. The error was mine. The cost of it has been hers." He looked across the room at Vivienne with a directness that was, she had always thought, the thing about him that made him most difficult and most worth knowing. Lady Cassel acted to protect me at cost to herself, without expectation of acknowledgement, and I failed to provide the acknowledgement she was owed. I am providing it now, in the room where it is most useful, which is the least I can do. Forsmore sat down. It was not a dramatic sit. There was no collapse, no visible defeat. But she sat, and the room registered it. The room was very quiet. Piers turned to Vivienne fully. He was across the room from her, and 40 people were between them, and the candles were burning, and she was aware of every detail of the moment with the particular clarity of things one will remember exactly. "Lady Cassel," he said, "I am asking you, in this room, before the same people who were present for the beginning of this, whether you will permit me the terms of an honest relationship. I am not in a position to offer you ease or a simple reputation or a story that is already settled in your favor. I can offer you someone who will not decide what you are before he has taken the trouble to find out. I was too proud for that 6 weeks ago. I would like to not be too proud for it now." The room waited. Vivienne looked at him. She looked at him for a real pause. Not a performance, not a social calculation, but the genuine pause of a woman deciding, in full view of 40 people, whether the thing she has wanted for 2 years is worth the cost of being seen to want it. "I accept," she said, "on condition that you accept mine." "Name them," he said. "I am not easy," she said. "I hold opinions that I do not abandon because they are inconvenient. I will tell you when you are wrong, and I expect you to tell me the same. And I will not pretend to certainties I do not have, in order to make either of us more comfortable." "Those," he said, with a quality in his voice that she recognized now as the one he used when he was most himself, "are exactly the terms I was proposing." The room heard this. It heard it as what it was, a beginning, public and witnessed, and made deliberately in the room where the alternative had played out. Several people, Vivienne would learn later, had described it as one of the more satisfying evenings of the season. Mrs. Alderton described it as the most useful use of 40 witnesses she had ever seen. Forsmore left before supper was served, and no one remarked on her absence. The dinner at Hartsmere House came 6 weeks later. It was a small dinner, 12 people, a shorter table, the same room but arranged differently. The 40 chairs replaced by 12, and the distance between the ends of the table reduced to something that felt human rather than ceremonial. Vivienne sat at the far end in a chair that was not the same chair as the one in October, but was near enough to the same position that she was aware of the echo. The syllabub arrived with the dessert course in the same crystal glass, and her dessert fork arrived with it this time, placed correctly, by a footman who had apparently been briefed. She looked at the syllabub. She looked up. Piers was watching her from the other end of the table. He had been watching her, she had noted, with the particular quality of attention that she had spent 2 years pretending not to notice, and that she was now, deliberately and without apology, noticing. He waited until the table's conversation had settled into the general murmur of a dinner well advanced. And then he asked, with complete seriousness and the faintest quality of something that was not quite a smile, whether the dessert met her standards this time. She considered the syllabub before her. She picked up her fork. She tasted it. "It will serve," she said. He did not look away. Neither did she. The candles burned steadily in the December dark, and the table between them was exactly the right length. And the room was warm, and she held his gaze across it with the ease of a woman who has decided, at last, to be known.